Have you ever wondered if the most powerful nations in the world are actually failing their own people? What if I told you that the very governments we rely on for security, freedom, and democracy are the ones eroding these values behind the scenes? In Failed States by Noam Chomsky, we uncover the unsettling truth about how even the wealthiest and strongest nations can fail, not through collapse, but by betraying their core principles. If you're ready to see the world through a new lens, this is the book you can't afford to miss. Noam Chomsky is one of the most influential intellectuals of our time, known for his groundbreaking work in linguistics, philosophy, and political activism. Often referred to as the father of modern linguistics, Chomsky has spent decades critiquing global power structures, media manipulation, and the misuse of state authority. With Failed States, Chomsky offers yet another compelling analysis, questioning the integrity of democratic governments and exposing how some of the world's most powerful nations undermine the very ideals they claim to uphold. His extensive background in both academia and activism gives him a unique perspective on the political issues that shape our world today. In Failed States, Noam Chomsky offers a deeply critical examination of the modern state system, focusing on how states, particularly powerful ones like the United States, often fail in their fundamental duties. Chomsky challenges the traditional view of failed states by expanding the definition beyond the typical lens applied to impoverished or war-torn nations, to include wealthy, democratic nations that undermine the values they claim to uphold. In this summary, I will unpack the key concepts from Failed States and show how Chomsky uses his analysis to address modern governance problems. What is a failed state? The conventional definition of a failed state typically refers to countries that cannot provide basic public services, ensure the security of their citizens, or maintain a functioning government. Chomsky argues that this definition can and should be broadened. A state can be considered failed, not only if it cannot control its territory but also if it fails to adhere to the principles it espouses, especially regarding democratic governance, civil liberties, and the rule of law. Chomsky's core critique is that the U.S., despite being a global superpower, increasingly exhibits the characteristics of a failed state. These include its failure to safeguard democratic values, human rights, and international peace. Key takeaway: a nation can appear stable and functional externally, yet fail internally by betraying its democratic principles and undermining the welfare of its people. The undermining of democracy. Chomsky asserts that the U.S. often fails to protect the democratic rights of its own citizens. While the country champions democracy abroad, it systematically undermines it at home. Through practices like gerrymandering, voter suppression, and the influence of corporate money in politics, the United States restricts genuine democratic participation. The elite class, according to Chomsky, wields an outsized influence on policy decisions, making the system less representative and accountable to ordinary citizens. He highlights the contradictions in the way democratic values are selectively promoted. While U.S. foreign policy often promotes the idea of spreading democracy, it simultaneously supports authoritarian regimes when it serves national or corporate interests. Key takeaway: democracy is not just about elections. It requires participation, equality, and protection from elite capture. When these elements are eroded, a state can be considered failed in its democratic mission. State-sponsored violence and international law. Another major focus of failed states is the role of state-sponsored violence and how powerful nations frequently violate international law. Chomsky criticizes U.S. foreign interventions, arguing that they often lead to chaos, destruction, and suffering in other nations while being justified under the guise of promoting freedom or security. Chomsky argues that the U.S. frequently defies international law with impunity, destabilizing entire regions through military action or covert operations. He points to examples like the Iraq War, where the rationale of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, was fabricated to justify an invasion that devastated the country. This, Chomsky argues, is symptomatic of a failed state that no longer respects international norms or the sovereignty of other nations. Key takeaway: when powerful states disregard international law and engage in unchecked violence, they not only destabilize the global order but also fail in their moral obligations. Economic injustice and corporate power. Chomsky delves into the economic dimensions of state failure by analyzing how neoliberal economic policies have eroded the social fabric of the United States. He critiques the widening gap between the rich and the poor, a hallmark of modern U.S. capitalism, as an indicator of a failed state. In Chomsky's view, corporate power has infiltrated the political system, effectively turning the government into a tool for advancing the interests of the wealthy elite. Public policies that prioritize corporate profits over the welfare of citizens, such as tax cuts for the rich, deregulation, and austerity measures, are central to this critique. Key takeaway: economic inequality is not just a byproduct of capitalism, it reflects the state's failure to uphold the social contract, where all citizens should have access to basic rights and opportunities. Erosion of civil liberties. Chomsky argues that the erosion of civil liberties, particularly in the post-9/11 era, further exemplifies the characteristics of a failed state. The U.S. government, under the guise of national security, has systematically expanded its surveillance powers, reduced personal freedoms, and increased its capacity for indefinite detention without trial. The expansion of executive power, alongside the suppression of dissent, reflects a broader authoritarian trend in which governments compromise civil rights for the sake of security. Chomsky points to the Patriot Act, Guantanamo Bay, and the NSA's surveillance programs as examples of how civil liberties are sacrificed, even in democracies. Key takeaway: a true democracy protects its citizens' rights even during times of crisis. When civil liberties are eroded, the state fails in its most basic duty to protect its people's freedoms. Propaganda and manufactured consent. Chomsky extends his critique to the role of media in shaping public perception and policy. He argues that the corporate-controlled media serves the interests of the elite, manufacturing consent for policies that would otherwise be unacceptable to the general population. This manipulation creates a false sense of public support for war, inequality, and other state actions that undermine the democratic process. According to Chomsky, the media's role in amplifying state propaganda, particularly during times of war, is a clear indication of how far a state can drift from democratic ideals. When public discourse is shaped by elite interests, the people are effectively denied the information they need to make informed decisions. Key takeaway: a free press is essential for a functioning democracy. When media serves as a mouthpiece for the state, public discourse becomes distorted, and democracy is weakened. A call for citizen action. Chomsky doesn't just diagnose the problem, he also offers solutions. One of his main calls to action is for citizens to engage more actively in the political process. The solution to failed states, in Chomsky's view, lies in grassroots activism and public pressure to hold governments accountable. He encourages ordinary citizens to take an active role in promoting democracy by demanding transparency, resisting corporate influence, and advocating for human rights and civil liberties. While failed states paints a bleak picture, Chomsky ultimately believes that change is possible if people remain informed and engaged. Key takeaway: democracy is only as strong as its citizens. Active participation, rather than passive acceptance, is crucial for holding failed states accountable and pushing for meaningful reform. What failed states means for us today. Failed states is a sobering look at the modern state system, with a particular focus on the failings of powerful democracies like the U.S. Chomsky's critique encourages us to rethink the criteria by which we judge a state's success or failure, emphasizing the importance of upholding democratic principles, international law, and economic justice. I'd like to leave you with a challenge. How can we, as engaged citizens, demand more from our governments? If we wish to prevent the rise of failed states, it starts with holding our leaders accountable, promoting real democracy, and ensuring that our institutions serve the people, not just the powerful elite. Let's continue to question, learn, and advocate for a better, more just world. Please subscribe for more.